Good afternoon. Welcome to the next session. I see many people I went for a little coffee break, which is always a smart idea around this time to get yourself in. Thanks for joining us for this last session of the day in Track 1, Education Reality. And today we have amazing speakers and you'll hear some interesting insights. To start us off, we have Dr. Cameron Graham with us, and his presentation is right up on the screen as well. Preparing students for complexity and uncertainty, which is an evidence-based argument for critical being as a pedagogical curriculum program. And Cameron comes to us with an extensive background in this area, a lecturer at Edinburgh Napier University.
New job in between.
And the CV is changing. Where he led the university's postgraduate certificate for early career academics and experiential UK professional standards framework, which was a fellowship scheme. He has many other credentials under his belt and worked on curriculum and staff development within the Department of Learning and Teaching Enhancement. And his PhD is in the form of higher education, and his research focuses on the scope of critical thinking and the academy and how it is considered a practice in teaching. He also has a specific interest in learning experiences of international students, which we all know often have to assimilate to the practices and conventions of their chosen country of study. So thank you, Cameron. Upon the conclusion of Cameron's presentation, we'll hear from Anna. And then at the end, as you know, we'll have a brief Q&A. So thanks, Cameron.
Cheers, thank you. Hi, everybody. So I'm coming to you from quite a different place to where we are just now. And apologies for my accent if it's challenging to anybody. I'll try to go slow, but I'm really passionate about this area. It links to my doctoral research. And yeah, so basically what I'm trying to do today is share with you how I'm trying to progress and translate my research around criticality or critical thinking into my new role within the curriculum, where I'm driving forward a curriculum framework within my Department of Learning and Teaching Enhancement. So my subject is education, so I sit at the centre of a large institution supporting colleagues in programmes. Clicker is not working. Oh, there we go. So just a quick overview. So I'm just going to provide a little bit of context and rationale as to why am I presenting this and sharing it with you. Why did I even bother spending 5 years of my life while I worked full-time studying this? And in doing so, I'll move on and talk about some of the literature and introduce to you not introduce, but for instance, talk you to the critical being, which may be new to some people, and is what I'm arguing should be the focus of pedagogy, but more so curriculum development. And I'll share with you my research design and some key findings from my qualitative and quantitative methodologies, and just start to introduce what I see as implications for practice, and just, yeah, leave open some insights and thoughts for you for your own practice as well. So I've used a little image, a kind of collage image, Cold War Steve. People from the UK may recognise that, and it's trying to capture for me the complexity and uncertainty that exists, and really, well, it links to the title of the conference in terms of applying education, a complex world. And so critical thinking, particularly for me as well as many other authors, is one, if not the main purpose of a higher education. It's ubiquitous, it's widely cited in literature and prospectuses, educational policy, for example, but its definition is never generally agreed upon. I mean, I could ask all yourselves now to write in a post-it note what you define critical thinking as, and I'm sure there'd be commonalities, but there would be key differences. And if we don't understand it or agree on it, understanding as educators, what hope the students have? So it's contested. Its development's largely assumed. Certainly in the UK, we don't measure critical thinking abilities in it. I know certainly in the US and potentially Canada as well, there's certain instruments and measures that are used to measure students' critical thinking. But again, they would then clash with epistemological positions. As an attribute and a skill and a disposition within graduates, I would argue it's more important now than ever, given the crises we live in. And I mean, everything from, well, AI, ChatGPT, fake news, populism, catastrophic climate crisis that we're in, and just the growing wealth inequality that we're experiencing all across the world. And then, as the intro said from my bio, international students are particularly, certainly from my own experience and certain other research, are really facing difficulty here, pronounced difficulties in relation to critical thinking, which is even more pronounced around certain Asian students or who are coming from very different contexts and cultures of learning and practices in academia, and are working in different languages as well. And for instance, in the UK anyway, we have a lot of students coming over internationally from all over the world, and they enter into master's study. And there's almost this assumption that everybody has a shared understanding or competency in critical thinking and subject knowledge. So what's critical thinking for? So 3 definitions here. So Ennis from 1985, one of the kind of tenets of the critical thinking movement in the US, defines it as reflective and reasonable thinking that's focused on deciding what to do or believe to do. Burbles and Bert, in a really widely cited paper in a compendium, talk about it very much thinking about argumentation again and focused on the individual. Whereas Stephen Brookfield, for example, a critical theorist, takes it that step further and moves into that social and political paradigm, speaking truth to power, to detect and resist ideological manipulation, to lay bare the abuses of power. However, again, it's largely related at the individual, I would argue. So we kind of move in terms of the scope of critical thinking from being very related to formal logic and cognition, argumentation, to then thinking about the technical application of that, where it sits within education, and then even more broadly, the likes of Henry Giroux, for example, and others, and Paulo Freire would argue it's far more political and social. I mean, Freire said education is inherently political, and I would agree. So moving towards criticality. So criticality is a concept, a term that was introduced by Professor Ronald Barnett of UCL way back before 1997, actually, but his seminal text, Higher Education, A Critical Business, really explores this in great depth. It's a broader concept in critical thinking. It includes thinking, reflecting, and acting. So it has three domains of the self, knowledge, the self, and the world. And I would argue that largely higher education curricula focuses on knowledge, as Ron would argue. We don't bring enough of the self or the world within our practices. However, I think certainly what I've witnessed today was a lot more of that, bringing in the world and bringing in the students as citizens of the world and engaging that within their learning, rather than kind of operating in a vacuum. So it expands us focus on critical thinking as an individual about skills and dispositions to how they work, engage with the world, for example, and thinking about citizenship and all these aspects, but particularly thinking about application in terms of actions, so that this isn't maybe an exercise that happens within a vacuum in a higher education classroom, and then you walk out into the world and it's just the tool is not been picked up and applied. Rather, this is something a little bit different. And this diagram here from Martin Davies just charts these differences, this movement, this progression from the critical thinking movement, it's called, to the criticality movement, to critical pedagogy, and towards critical participation. And the key thing is we're moving from thinking, so cognition, to actually doing. So it becomes part of living. It's not just an exercise in cognition or deliberation, for example. So then I would pose to you, do you think that critical thinking as a focus is enough for higher education in the 21st century? And I would say no. And Barnett and Davies would argue that the term criticality has been introduced because it is so distinct from critical thinking that it's not adequate enough to really convey the potential that this concept, and it is relatively simple to be fair, has at its hand. And this is Jerry Dunn from Trinity College Dublin, I believe. And for me, this just encapsulates this movement, this conceptual movement that criticality is trying to promise, in the sense that it's not something, in contrast to critical thinking, which maybe sees, I would argue, is slightly instrumental. It's like a tool you might pick up to use for a particular task. Rather, that criticality isn't something you can switch on or it's engaged, but rather it's as critical being, as Ron Barnett, as I'm going to talk about in a minute, introduces, is really embedded within our everyday activities and experiences. And it's not the kind of thing we can turn on and off. And actually, just remember, one of my participants in my interview as a student talked about it as a form of antennae. So it's part of you, it's there, and you kind of embody it. So my theoretical approach for my doctoral research then was followed Ron Barnett's work, in particular this concept of critical being. So as I said, there's three domains or three types of criticality. Critical reason, which is located in the domain of knowledge. Critical self-reflection, which is within self, and then critical action, which sits within the domain of the world. He then introduces this rather complex, and I'll admit it is complex, and I've critiqued it myself in my thesis at length, this table here. And the table unites both, or sorry, first of all, you've got your forms of criticality, reason, self-reflection, critical action, and they're aligned with the domains of knowledge, self, and world. And then he introduces 4 levels of criticality, and with increasing complexity. And as you can see, they're here. However, I find them quite hard to work with, and I think they could be challenging to apply into practice. But essentially, it's just this notion of multiple domains and this interdependent kind of fluctuating relation that they have with one another. And it's really considering the person, the student, the learner as a whole, rather than just somebody sitting in a classroom, for example. So my research design then, so I did my PhD part-time as I worked full-time as an academic, so it took me quite a bit of time, but in a sense that helped with a longitudinal aspect of it. And so I did questionnaires, I should say it was with master's students in 3 different universities in the UK. And I had a 15-minute self-completion questionnaire. I had 296 students complete that. Of that, there was 41 different nationalities across 13 different master's courses. But just the amount of nationalities just captures what I was trying to say to you about the volume of international students that we have and the diversity of them. There's no way they're going to come with common experiences. So it's about really trying to harness that, but also recognise the difference and where can we support them, and particularly when critical thinking is this key aim of higher education at master's level as well. It's even more pronounced, that focus on mastersness. So I interviewed them at the start of an academic year after their induction weeks. After I had, sorry, that was questionnaires. After I'd done the questionnaires, I'd asked them if they wanted to, the survey completed with a section where it invited them to, if they wanted to come for an interview, to fill that in and share an email address where I'd contact them. I then interviewed 18 students across these 3 different master's courses, and really in-depth interviews where what happened is the focus kind of changed and it became far more personal, in the sense of it became about them as an individual and everything they brought, and actually a lot of this linked to their previous experience. So everything about epistemological positioning, educational experiences, family background, for example, really, as they spoke, gave context to where they were in terms of how they consider critical thinking, criticality, and yeah, just their views and experiences. So it was quite telling. I then interviewed 4 academic staff who were the programme leaders of the courses these students were studying on, or some of the courses, and I interviewed them after I interviewed the students. So I could almost confirm or validate or refute some of the suggestions or some of what students had portrayed. So it was very interesting indeed. The questionnaire used 2 different inventories, validated scales, one of which was Edward Sozu's critical thinking disposition scale. And what I actually did was looked at how students consider, or asked students, the importance of critical thinking to them within their everyday life. So the kind of antennae thing or criticality, that's this embodied notion, as opposed to how important it would be for their working career. And students, as you can see, felt it far more important for the workplace. So it was far more a kind of attribute for employability than it was a life, a competency, for example. And so that was a significant result. I also asked them about their conception of critical thinking. What did they understand by it? So, and this is huge diversity. So, for instance, we started off from a basic understanding or position of being a dissident, so a very different notion of critical thinking that we might expect of a master's student, to evaluating both sides up and down, so a real binary kind of dialectical approach, to, at the other end of the spectrum, the ability to question, to challenge something, to have the courage to think differently. And then probably the broadest view I would have seen is, I've got this last quote, questioning, analysing and critiquing the world around you. So massive gulf there in interpretation or perception or conceptions. And then the interviews. So this is just some kind of key headline, because I could talk to you all day about this. It's such a large part of my life in that sense, and I've just got so much from it. I've had to cut out of my thesis and whatever else. But role of dialogue. So this is simple stuff. Papers have said it for a while, but again, we don't often do it in education. We have a mass higher education system. We often talk to students rather than have them talk with us, for example. But the role of dialogue, that international, intercultural communication was the kind of key driver in students engaging in this critical process, where group discussion was the key emphasis of that. Just talking to other students and sharing life experiences and getting their perceptions or perspectives on something, and just the differing aspects of that. How they kind of created little communities of practice inside but also outside of classroom. And then one student, a Taiwanese student, actually said that he found being spoken to, he actually talked about how there were so many students that put them in the lecture hall for this program, so they put them in a gymnasium. And he said it was a dehumanizing experience being spoken to. And what he said, I had the papers that I read in preparation for the class recited back at me, and I think so many thousand a year for this experience. That was dehumanizing. He then took on a student rep role and shared that back, and there was changes to the curriculum. And engagement difference. So as I said about the nationality of students, they really found that engagement, that kind of trading off in a sense, and just experiencing the people's views and diversity really brought something as a learning resource, where they acted as critical mirrors to one another's experiences. And as I mentioned, the epistemological beliefs and the reticence to really challenge authority, or even textbooks. They would say to me, if somebody has written that, they must be a doctor or a professor. Who am I to challenge it? And then a midwifery student, a UK student, said, it's not my place to criticise policy. That's somebody with a degree already, and I think it was in environmental science, and they're going in to be a nurse. We want them to critique policy. We want things to be enhanced. So again, just looks at what we're working with. And then academic literacies. So those conventions, practices that we need to engage in to succeed at university, they're often hidden and they're mystified. And that links to Karl Martin's work and many, many other things, like legitimation code theory, for example. But as one student said, it's like the rules of the game. So this was a high-flying student from a US university. So she came in, so she was at one end of the spectrum. I'm too good for this. I'm overly prepared. My peers are miles behind me. I see it reflected in my grades, for example. But it's because I know the rules of the game. I know what the tutors want. I know what I need to present. These guys don't. They're having to learn, and it's reflected in their grades, i.e. international students not conversant with their academic practices and expectations. So, for example, one Chinese student talked about they just want to provide what the tutor wants. So very formulaic. They're not really expressing and demonstrating the learning. So they're kind of, it's that conformity. They're mimicking criticality to give what the teacher wants, to meet criteria. And then related to these kind of three things that I found in working in conjunction with one another with the students' experiences were dialogue, the diversity of the student body, and then the differing perspectives that those students brought. And that when they coalesced, it acted as an ideal condition for criticality development, such like some of these students who were less conversant with academic practices and expectations then got an insight into what they were through class discussion with other students, where they started to pick that up and construct an understanding. And where dialogue worked as internal feedback, this is a work that David Nichols cited here, through that comparison of perspectives and view on topics that students are really gaining from that. So much so in his research actually finds that students, and it also links to research on self-regulation, that students value peer feedback more than tutor feedback. As horrifying as that may seem to want to provide tons of feedback to students. And at the international aspect, that student diversity really brought up that broad perspective, and that the confrontation of difference in experience and understanding and beliefs, views, worldviews, for example, really allowed them to open up, challenge, and see things differently as well. And because again, going back to the epistemological aspect, many students from different contexts said there's one answer, but they've come to study at master's level in a social science area, and they're told, no, there isn't. You create an argument, you support it with evidence, and that's it. There is no right or wrong. And that was stunning to them. They had gone through an education where there is one answer, and they have to regurgitate facts or knowledge, and they've been told, no, none of that matters to a certain extent. So it's really it's I dread to think how they really feel about it. But we've got a lot of work to do, I would say. So some of the key findings were these rules of the game and how that for some they had a route in, they were able to really succeed, demonstrate, to learn their knowledge. Others they scrambled around in the dark unless they had some of these experiences where they could engage in contexts of difference. Students held such a wide variety of conceptions from really macro, and so some really micro understanding, as I said, that kind of binary of light and dark, some called it as well, right through to that engagement and critiquing of the world around you and how you engage in it. And then, as I said about that epistemological positioning about how you view knowledge and how that maybe that would mediate how critical or not they were, sorry. And the students then, after I'd analysed all the data, how they were found to be operating at different levels of the framework I showed you from Barnett's in terms of the 4 levels and the 3 domains, where only 3 students out of the 18 I interviewed, I could say, who had become critical beings. They could engage at the highest levels in all 3 of these domains, whereas others were really at maybe just in the knowledge domain. And again, these are all master students. We're all going to get the same certificate at the end of the day, but they've had massively different learning experiences. So one of the students who became, or I was classifying as a critical being, was Orla. And she said, criticality kind of becomes part of who you are. It's part of how you think about things, how you do things. And that was completely different from some learners who said they just used it to analyse papers, and how they said, when I return back home, I won't be critical thinking. No, they don't want it. I'm a kindergarten teacher, I don't want to think critically, or it's dangerous in my context. And this was one of the outputs of my research, 2 outputs actually. The top one is a spectrum I created of these conceptions of critical thinking the students presented in this open text field in the survey, where I had the very dialectical, that evaluating upside and downsides, to that enlightening, where it's opened their eyes and they're really engaging with the world. And I put this in a spectrum of from knowing through becoming to then being, so towards this critical being. So where knowing relates to this first level of the framework criticality that Barnett says, so it's about critical skills. So it's really situated in the domain of knowledge and that kind of simple level. What we might say in the UK is a kind of first or second year of a 4-year degree, or certainly in Scotland, we've got 4-year undergraduate degrees. The becoming would start to encapsulate how students develop criticality through the lower to intermediate levels, and where that incorporates reflexivity and the refashioning of traditions of the discipline, for example. And they would operate in some of these domains some of the time, but not all simultaneously. And then we're being really encapsulate that vision that Barnett has of the critical person, where they operate across all 3 domains into the highest level, and the highest level being, as Barnett called it, transformative critique. And so I've tried to capture that with putting this spectrum and the colorization of it onto the framework, where this would be the knowing, right through to this would be where the critical beings are up here, straddling all 3 domains simultaneously. So now it brings it back to my practice. So this is Barnett's 3 domains. And some other work of Barnett was really widely cited. He's got a model called the Engaged Curriculum. So it's a seminal text from himself and Kelly Cope from 2005. And yeah, so the quote there is, a complex, uncertain world requires curriculum which students as human beings are placed at the centre. What is called for are curriculum that offer no less than the prospect of encouraging the formation of human being and becoming. So I see a transference here from 1997 work right through to here, where you can see the knowing, the knowledge linked to the knowing. Acting would be the self or world, and likewise being in the world. So I'm trying to translate that high-level theory into a curricular model which he's presented to then link to my own work. So this is a curriculum framework that I'm now trying to progress the implementation of in my role in my own university. So it's the enhanced curriculum framework. And at the centre we have the student. So what I am trying to translate from my research and reading, for example, is try to take this theoretical underpinning where the student sits at the centre there and try to encourage staff, programme teams to think about that. How do we get this engaged curriculum? We engage the students as what they need to know, how they need to act, how they need to be. it's not just about for me, anyway, it's not just about the job at the end of the day, because I mean, well, I'm not in the career that my first degree got me. I've changed a couple of times now. I'm now in one different, but again, it's that portfolio career. And again, we need much more than just critical thinking for particular tasks. Think about the world we live in, and that's what we need to prepare students for. So this is how I'm trying to translate that. So there's other 5 key themes here. We have 2 cross-cutting themes: citizenship and community, digital and information literacy. Now, if I had written this framework, I would have scrapped this digital and information literacy and just had 3 C's. I would have had citizenship, community, and criticality. But so this is how I'm trying to translate it. But another part of that translation is, because we've got distinct challenges around assessment, is trying to think about how assessment could be a vehicle to actually try to pull this into the curriculum quite quickly and with a focus on the learner. And so that brings us to more recent research by Margaret Bierman in Australia. And so she argues that a gap exists within higher education between our assessments and the world in which we live and work. You've probably all heard about the term authentic assessment, and there's now more and more literature around that. But again, authentic assessment, as I would argue about traditional conceptions of critical thinking, are narrow, and it's focused on the mantra of employability, which is something that higher education for far more than employability. Certainly that's what I got out of higher education, a transformative experience where my worldview changed just through having that little key. So Brown and Sambo, they've been arguing for quite a while about a move away from assessment just seen as a product towards encouraging that active student learning, where it's a vehicle for that. So we'll think about the processes of learning, not just products. And when think about your own undergraduate degrees, I'm assuming that when I was an undergrad, you just produced essays that you dropped them off in a submission box somewhere and you never saw them again. So trying to bring assessment to life, have meaning that goes beyond just something that you drop and move on at the end of a module and for another course, for example. So we're thinking about how we can have authentic assessment, which provides meaningful context to allow students to make connections between their lives and their university-based experiences. So for me, I see convergences here with what I've been talking about around Barnett. And then this brings us to a Canadian, actually, who's now in the UK, Jan MacArthur. And she's got a very good paper recently, actually, around authentic assessment, where she takes a critical theoretical view and works with some of the conceptions. Well, she works with I'm not going to get into it, Heidegger, Adorno, etc. But she argues for 3 conceptual shifts in authentic assessment, because she critiques authentic assessment as too narrowly viewed around employability of the world of work, and this view of the real world as if we don't live in the real world. And anyway, she's arguing for these shifts. So first of all, give the focus to society as a whole rather than that world of work or this real world in quotations, air quotes. And instead of focusing on the task, the essay, the report, whatever it may be, consider the value of students engaging in that task and how that validates their social belonging or engagement in society and the world. And then thinking about authentic assessment as a vehicle for transformative change rather than reinforcing the status quo. So, for example, somebody else mentioned it this morning about capitalism. We're all living in capitalism. I mean, spending, eating, as we drive towards destruction, it's just utter madness to a certain extent. So we need to change. But we live in this kind of, well, certainly from what I experience or see, is a lot of higher education. We see things as fixed and static, and we operate as if they are. I mean, we have a business school in my university, as most universities, and we're still teaching students. We're still in this paradigm, rather than maybe think, what could we do differently? What could we change? So that's what Jan is trying to argue, that thinking about how we can look at how students can act upon that world and really look at change. And I'm thinking about some of the discussions this morning about, and sustainability would be one way to try to bring that in. And so then I'm just going to finish up and just leave you with that quote from Jan, which is authentic assessment, is not assessment that worlds the world as it is, but it's that which pushes the possibilities of what the world could be. And for me, that's how I think I can start to translate some of this theoretical argument or framework and this argumentation to bring the self and the world to complement knowledge and move purely beyond the development of disciplinary knowledge for students to bring that into the curriculum and to support colleagues in doing so. And there's my references. And thank you for bearing with me and listening.
Well, we have Anna here too. Here next, so let me go to the podium. Thank you for the insights. I really, what spoke to me about your presentation was just the idea about bringing their work to life, and as someone who's an educator and works with community collaborations and internships, I really see value in that statement. So thank you. Well, Anna's presentation is being queued up here a bit. Today, Anna will talk to us about futures, teaching, and interdisciplinary practice. Anna comes from us to visit us as an assistant professor in the School of Creative Arts at the University of the Fraser. Her research is focused on decolonial pedagogy and how arts-based education for sustainable development, along with embodied pedagogies, can also be activated to create a more inclusive engagement. Her work on creative interdisciplinary collaboration through the Creativity Lab informs her teaching practice. And I really like this kind of equation that you have. In short, EDI plus creativity plus interdisciplinary plus sustainability equals a better future. Thank you, Anna.
So I'm actually going to start by asking you to stand up, if you're able to. And take a nice deep breath and reach up. And then reach back and maybe look up. Yeah, right. And then interlace your fingers and press through around your spine. If you have space and you feel upright, you can just flop yourself over. I'm standing up so you can hear me, but you're going to just take a couple of deep breaths wherever you are, flopped over or standing up, and just take like 3 really good deep breaths. As was mentioned, I look at embodied pedagogy a lot. If you're flopped over, you can slowly start to roll up. And I teach in the School of Creative Arts, and I teach in performance studies and theater. So this kind of activity is how I often start my classes. Or stay standing, right, sitting all day. And today what I'm going to share with you is the story of SOCA 401, Critical Theory for Creative Arts. And it's a capstone course, so it's a 4th-year course in the School of Creative Arts. And so it brings together people from theater, visual arts, media arts, and film. But when I was trying to think about how to actually talk about this very messy interdisciplinary course that I taught, what I'm actually have distilled it into 3 principles that guided the design of the course that I believe are really critical in the world that we are teaching for. As many people have said, we live in this moment of unprecedented change, from global ecological crises to political ruptures to this really swiftly moving world of AI. And our students face a world that's very different from our present. And our job as educators is to help them to develop the skills of adaptability, flexibility, and I really think the ability to think and work across disciplines and differences. And so beyond the hard skills and techniques, what's needed now more than ever are capacities of cohesive collaboration, critical and creative thinking, and an ability to see from multiple perspectives across time and across trajectories. And what this requires from us, educators in the room, is a different way of teaching. And I'm not alone in thinking this. Many people, including the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, who published this paper called The Future of Education and Skills 2030, see these 4 categories as really critical 21st century skills: creativity, critical thinking, communication, and collaboration. But many people, and we've had discussions about this today, many people in industry and in academia alike say that our students fall short in these really critical 21st century skills. Partly because our education systems continue to focus on knowledge acquisition and siloed disciplinary divisions. Scholars like Mishra and Mehta and Jazard argue that these skills that we fall short of today are also the skills that we're going to need in the future. It's a very uncertain future that we're trying to educate for. And these aren't new skills, I don't think, but they are very human skills, and they're something that we can foster in our classes. I align with Dargely, Moody, and Lubart, who advocate for both students and faculty to engage in creative interdisciplinary collaboration, since it fosters the ability to, in their words, think and act creatively at the interface and beyond the disciplines in an agile and insightful way. So, as I said, I'm telling a story today about SOCA 401. And I'm going to basically, instead of talking through the syllabus, which I can share with you later if you're interested in, I'm talking about these 3 anchoring principles that were woven into the class. So SOCA 401 is an interdisciplinary course structured around theoretical lenses that I chose to really help students understand and think critically about the complexities of the world and the creative work that they make. As I taught it, each week was anchored by a theory chosen for its ability to explain the context we live in and the future that we'll probably inhabit. Each week we engaged with theory through individual written responses, discussion and praxis activities, which I'll talk about in a moment. And we use these theories to analyze examples of art, culture, and performance. The theories that I chose, I think, really helped to build specific capacities that we will need as people living in this contemporary moment who face this really uncertain future. So critical theory, for instance, can help students develop a deeper understanding of social and cultural contexts their work exists in, enabling them to challenge dominant narratives and power structures. Pluriversality encourages students to appreciate the diversity of perspectives and knowledge systems across cultures and communities, promoting a more inclusive and respectful approach to collaboration and problem solving. Ethical relationality, another one of the theories that anchored our course, emphasizes the importance of relationships and focuses on interconnection. And futures thinking provides the important skill of thinking along trajectories and then recognizing how certain actions that we take now propel us towards certain futures. And while the theories themselves are important, the class is about critical theory, our approach to them is what I highlight as the first principle that we adopted in the course, which is an ethic of generous critical reading. And this idea of generous critical reading is inspired by queer theorist Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's idea of reparative reading. So in contrast to traditional critique methods that primarily focus on deconstructing a text, really pulling it apart, generous critical reading is an approach that encourages readers to seek out multiple interpretations of a text, rather than just looking for the flaws and the errors and trying to kind of outsmart the author. Generous critical reading is an approach that emphasizes the importance of engaging with diverse perspectives and really trying to consider the author's intentions and context. We deeply consider what the theory allows us to see or understand about our worlds before we then try to intervene and say where it falls short. So each week we applied a theoretical lens to our own lives and our art practices in the self-reflections that they did. So for example, the week that we studied Sian Nai's aesthetic categories of cute, zany, and interesting, students were asked to take photographs of things within their lives that they thought captured what Nai was talking about in terms of these aesthetic categories. And then they had to write about their choices and unpack the theory, but from a really personal place. Rather than just simply summarizing and then critiquing the text, this praxis-based, generous critical reading allows us to adopt the perspective of the theory, to really try it out and try to understand it, and then talk about what was useful, where it falls short, and some of the critique that can come after. As Hammond and Watson note, generous critical reading encourages openness, flexibility, and critical thinking, enabling us to approach texts in a way that allows for more nuanced and complex understandings of the world around us. The principle of generous critical reading, guiding our investigations of the specific theories that we covered, helped us to think through our connections to one another, but also our connections to place. Personally connecting to different perspectives leads to my second guiding principle, regenerative pedagogy. So regenerative pedagogy is kind of under the umbrella of ESD, or Education for Sustainable Development. And it's an approach to education that incorporates regenerative design principles into learning systems. It recognizes that our world is built around interconnected relationships between humans, between other living beings, and the ecosystems that we exist in, addressing the social and environmental challenges we face, and understanding that these are actually really dependent on restoring and rebalancing the relationships between humans and the more than human world that we exist in. For me, regenerative approaches to education help us to reconnect to land and place, and to consider how we are actually very interdependent and part of nature, not overlords of it. And one of the ways that I tried to really foster this principle was through a long duration land art, place art project. So we started this project on the first class of term. Students were asked to find a secluded spot in a nature-dense area of campus and create a piece of non-permanent nature-based land art. And none of them had experience doing this. I just gave some general instructions that I'm kind of walking you through right now. The students were instructed to only use what was in that specific area they had chosen, to respect the ecosystem that they were engaging in, and to let living things live. They could not rip or pull or transplant things. They were first asked to find a place that called to them, very vague, but that's what I said, to just sit with it, and then create a piece of art from the found materials that were in that area. In the reflection that they did afterwards, students were asked about how they felt during the process, how they selected the site and the materials, and what their experience was like during and after its creation. And so this land art, place art, it was never marked. There was not a grade for the actual art that they produced, but it was a site that they needed to visit at multiple points throughout the term. And it was often woven into the weekly responses, and they had a kind of consolidating reflexive essay at the very end of term that asked them to think through their place art site as kind of a physical metaphor. Students visited it every few weeks, documenting changes and reflecting on their art or the land in relation to the theory that we were studying. So they were using it as this kind of metaphor for their learning at various points in the term. They were instructed not to alter anything. They weren't trying to fix it or tidy it up. Because as you can see in this student's kind of documentation of what happened, things were removed. Sometimes it was natural causes, the weather took some people's land art away, and sometimes it was humans who came in and tidied things up. And so that's why there's a land art / place art, because as the land art itself became, it went away for many people, the place was the most important anchoring point for them, and so they still continue to visit their place art site. So certain weeks, students were really deeply reflecting on their place art or their land art in relation to the theory. And I'm going to just read really briefly part of the student's response in the week that we studied critical theory. And in it, she cites an essay that we read near the beginning of term by Eula Biss called The Theft of the Commons. And she's writing about this piece on the screen. She writes, "Just a week after originally making my land art, I returned to see that the rockside place had been removed, the plants had been watered, and the so-called weeds had been removed. At first, I was very upset and even hurt that my art had been deliberately removed, especially since my art would not have caused any damage to its surroundings. But seeing this revealed a truth to me. The land is not a commons." She goes on to, she goes on to say that the system of capitalism is self-serving, as pointed out by critical theorists, and deliberately does not consider the collective well-being of society and nature. Indeed, the university probably believes that they're doing something beneficial by providing students with beautiful gardens to enjoy. But suddenly I question why we consider certain yards messy or ugly, while upkept, neat ones are beautiful. Where did we get these standards of beauty? At the end of the term, students wrote a reflexive essay that consolidated their learning, and they were prompted to reread all of their weekly responses and write about the patterns that they noticed emerging through them, any of the values that they could see they held, and some of the assumptions that they tended to make. I also asked them to consider their place art photographs and observations as a physical metaphor to explain their thinking about the world and how it changed over the semester. The reflections show deep engagement with the theories, as well as the student sense of place. So again, I'm bringing in lots of student voices because they're the real testament to this class. Again, quoting from a student, They write, "The place still has significance on its own, and I can recognize that without disturbing the land." A quote from the end of my response sums up the ideas I've translated here about colonialism and the disruption of place. Can I be upset that my art was ruined? Or would the stones be upset that I moved or stole them in the first place? Maybe it's just better for me to sit in that place in proximity to all of the stones together and feel the land and energy around me without disturbing them. From week 6. Another student wrote, "One of the core aspects of this course I should point out is the ability of looking for nuances and the willingness to be open and learn something new in order to grow intellectually. Both the study of the weekly materials and my place art emphasize this concept. The more attention and the more curiosity you give in examining the world around you and the material you study, the more you notice the details that create the uniqueness in each piece, from academic texts to works of art to natural elements." But theory and this long duration art project that they did was only half of the course. The other half was dedicated to the third principle, interdisciplinary praxis. Interdisciplinarity and the ability to create across disciplines is an important capacity we can be guiding students through. While most of us are familiar what interdisciplinary is, or what interdisciplinarity is, praxis can have a few different meanings. And so for me, coming from the world of performance studies, praxis is the integration of theory and practice, where theory can be used to enhance creative practice, and where creative practices can actually be used to explore theoretical ideas. So for example, back to this week when we were looking at the aesthetics of cute, zany, and interesting. After a mini lecture and a discussion of each of these categories, groups were tasked to putting the theory into practice. The group working on cute sketched a huge number of line drawings of animals, applying all of the characteristics that Nye discusses: big eyes, a sense of vulnerability, some femininity, etc. And they chose to display them. This is only a few of them captured here, but in a room or a space that's probably this big, there were line drawings all around the space, and they were right at floor level with a little sign. You can see it on the right-hand side of the screen that says, "Welcome to our home." And this was a really smart choice that they made because they said it required you to bend down like this to kind of get closer. And this kind of posture is one of the cute aesthetics, right? If we think about how people take photographs. So it actually asked us to embody some of Nye's aesthetic category. So I thought that was really brilliant. So this is an example of praxis, but beyond engaging each of the theories through praxis, the students worked all semester long on an interdisciplinary praxis-based project based on a real-world problem that they had identified. So at the very start of term, again, we have these really long duration projects in this class. At the very start of term, students organized themselves into interdisciplinary teams of 4 or 5 people, and they selected a problem category to work on, either post-pandemic community, human-nature relationships, attention and technology, or the role of arts in a circular economy. So the classes are 3 hours long. The first half is discussion and praxis and doing things with theory. The second half we called our interdisciplinary studio group workshop time. So the second half of each class was dedicated to the interdisciplinary groups, and they worked on scaffolded tasks based on interdisciplinary problem-based learning with a twist that I put in at the end. Because I really wanted to try to foster the actual granular mechanics of how to work and create across disciplines. I'm going to briefly talk through the process and then share some of the final projects with you. So the process yes, I also regret my color choices. I apologize. The first step was to identify their problem category. So the students chose whatever category called to them, whichever they were interested in, and they collaboratively wrote a problem statement. This was the specific and narrower problem that they were going to investigate for step 2, which was their multidisciplinary report. So after getting the problem together, clarifying it, they individually in their groups wrote a multidisciplinary report, and each student was instructed to find 3 articles or pieces of scholarly work from different disciplines. All the people in the group needed to choose a different discipline or subdiscipline. And so for most projects, the groups had between 12 and 15 different disciplines represented. within their multidisciplinary reports. So they had these different perspectives on a problem that they were researching. They were further challenged because I asked them, well, I required that they could choose a maximum of one article written by a white cisgendered man, and they had to choose one article written by a BIPOC woman. The third perspective was their choice. And what this did is it opened a really fruitful conversation about systemic issues in research and publishing, and it required a balance of representation and perspectives. So they wrote their individual reports, they submitted them to me, but they also gave an oral report to their group. And this is step 3, data sharing and interdisciplinary analysis. During the class where they gave these oral reports sharing what they had found, they mapped their findings on the whiteboard. And these were huge whiteboards full of messy notes. But they were really discussing they were beginning this process of interdisciplinary analysis, trying to make sense of what all of the data was showing them from these different disciplines. Here they moved from this kind of comprehensive understanding of how different disciplines understand, frame, and discuss the problem that they were working with, to an interdisciplinary conversation about connections and conflicts and holes or places where the research wasn't really addressing the topic. I asked them to look for emerging themes, patterns, and places most research didn't consider, and then instructed them that they were going to base their transdisciplinary projects on those ideas or those places. I really wanted them to find ways to intervene in the conversations that were happening about their topic and which the students themselves were really interested in. So this is the twist part of the interdisciplinary problem-based learning, the transdisciplinary arts-based project. So in the final stage, groups were asked to transcend disciplines, so going from working between disciplines and understanding between disciplines to then transcending them to create an integrated arts-based response to the problem. All the students were asked to participate in the creation of that. They could organize themselves however they wanted to, using the skills and the particular interest that each student had. But they all had to work together. It had to be presented somehow at the end of the class, or at the end of the semester, I mean. And they had to have a written statement of some kind, an artist statement about it. Final projects included a board game called Surviving the Pandemic, Work Edition. You can see one of them, an installation that integrated a sculpture created from disposed coffee cups and clay, along with an Instagram account called Coexist, to promote arts-based climate activism. We had many board games. Another board game was created called Surviving Humankind, which required players to become geopolitical forces making decisions about natural resources. There was a video game concept promoting mental health, self-care, and individuality, a satirical promo video interrogating wearable technology, and a short book titled The Young Artist Guide to Circular Economy, which suggests various ways artistic disciplines can embrace, support, and profit from a circular economy. The class took up the challenge of how arts and humanities can create more than just a more just and sustainable world. And they really developed these projects that were exciting. They were quite rigorous because they were informed by data, and very creative because they were drawing on the students' interests, skill set, and passions. One team analyzed the post-COVID community of students that they were in, and the inequities faced during digital learning throughout the pandemic lockdowns that we went through. They created this interactive sculpture/game called Dismantling Colonial Structures to Conceptualize New Educational Possibilities, which was based on this iterative cycle where one structure was broken down and a new structure was collectively built. It was dependent on verbal communication and the different perspectives of multiple participants being woven in, highlighting the importance of pluriversality when creating new sustainable systems that will benefit a diverse range of users. Their transdisciplinary artwork/game addressed the broader issue of inequity within the education system and provides a model for a possible solution. Reflecting on their project, one of the group's members said, "I have learned how important it is to learn from other people's perspectives, and that my solution to design problems will not be the best solution if it doesn't include other points of view." So while the final projects were interesting, and some of them were, like this one was really quite comprehensive. The process that we went through to get to the final product, to me, is more important than the things that they created. Learning these really granular mechanics of interdisciplinary collaboration, deeply engaging with praxis and real world problems, and creating meaningful art-based interventions was a really rich experience for many of the students. And I hope it helped them to develop some capacities that are transferable and applicable beyond the classroom. Overall, this approach, I think, is really useful in a complex world that requires us to rethink education systems, and it's particularly relevant in this moment of AI. I think educators, we're all recognizing that we really need to think and teach differently, to assess differently, and really wrestle with what deep learning is. And courses like this are opportunities for deep applied learning and critical self-reflection that have new kind of importance in this moment that we're in. We can't pretend that the future our students are emerging into is business as usual. We can't ignore that the world needs people who understand systems and the ways we are all interconnected. And I don't think we should downplay the calls for us to better facilitate capacities of collaboration and communication across difference and perspectives. I think we need to recognize that all of us, the artists included, can contribute our skills to address the crises we find ourselves in. The world we live in and the problems we face are enormously complex, and our students must be equipped with the skills and experiences to navigate them and flourish. In this regard, I believe that we actually have an ethical responsibility as educators to move away from outdated modes of education and embrace a way of teaching that fosters the capacities we need today, but then also in the future. Thank you.